The basement smelled like despair and industrial bleach, a combination that hit Officer Marcus Rivera like a physical blow when he forced open the steel door. 3 years on the force had exposed him to plenty of human misery, but nothing had prepared him for what waited in the concrete chamber beneath the abandoned textile warehouse. A woman sat hunched in the corner of what could only be described as a cage, 8 feet by 8 feet of reinforced steel mesh, padlocked from the outside like she was some kind of dangerous animal. Her dark skin was ashen from lack of sunlight, her graying hair matted and unkempt. The torn clothing and bare feet screamed homeless, but something about her posture suggested a dignity that homelessness alone couldn't explain. "Ma'am?" Rivera called softly, his flashlight cutting through the basement's oppressive darkness. "I'm Officer Rivera. I'm here to help." The woman looked up, and Rivera felt his breath catch. Her eyes weren't vacant or drug-addled like he'd expected. They were sharp, intelligent, and filled with something that looked like relief mixed with terror. "They said I was dead," she whispered, her voice hoarse but articulate. "But I remember everything." Rivera felt ice form in his veins. Not the rambling of someone experiencing a psychotic break, but the clear statement of someone who'd been through hell and lived to tell about it. "Who said you were dead?" Rivera asked, approaching the cage slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio. "My sister. The doctors. The lawyers." The woman's voice grew stronger with each word. "They all agreed it was better this way. Cleaner." Rivera examined the padlock securing the cage door. Heavy-duty commercial grade, the kind used for storage units or industrial facilities. Not something a mentally ill homeless woman could have fashioned herself. This wasn't a makeshift shelter, this was deliberate imprisonment. "What's your name?" he asked, working his bolt cutters on the lock mechanism. "Celeste. Celeste Washington." She paused, watching him work. "At least, that's who I used to be. Before I died." The lock snapped open with a metallic crack that echoed through the basement like a gunshot. Rivera pulled the cage door wide, but Celeste didn't immediately move. She sat there, staring at the opening as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. "How long have you been down here?" Rivera asked gently. "Time stops meaning much when you're dead." Celeste finally stood, her movements careful and deliberate. "But the seasons have changed, many times." Rivera's radio crackled to life. "Unit 47, what's your status on that anonymous tip?" He keyed the mic, never taking his eyes off Celeste. "Dispatch, I need backup and paramedics at my location. Also send Detective Brooks if she's available. We've got a situation that's going to need investigation." "Copy that, Unit 47. What kind of situation?" Rivera looked around the basement, noting details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. A camping toilet in one corner. Cases of bottled water stacked against the wall. Industrial-sized containers of simple meals, the kind used for disaster relief or institutional feeding. A small space heater connected to an illegal electrical tap. Someone had been keeping Celeste alive down here, but barely. Possible kidnapping and imprisonment, Rivera reported. Extended duration. As he helped Celeste toward the basement stairs, she moved with surprising steadiness. Whatever ordeal she'd endured, it hadn't broken her physically. But when they reached the bottom of the staircase, she stopped abruptly. "Officer Rivera," she said, her voice carrying sudden urgency. "There's something you need to understand about my situation." "What's that?" Celeste reached into the torn pocket of her jacket and produced something that made Rivera's pulse spike. A hospital bracelet, faded and worn but still legible. The kind used for patient identification during extended stays. "Washington, Celeste M." Rivera read aloud. "Patient ID 7741. Admitted March 15, 2008. He looked up at her sharply. This is 15 years old. 15 years, 3 months, and 12 days, Celeste confirmed with chilling precision. That's when I was supposed to die. Rivera studied the bracelet more closely. Riverside Psychiatric Institute, a facility he knew had been shut down years ago amid allegations of patient abuse and insurance fraud. The kind of place that specialized in making inconvenient people disappear. Celeste, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Whatever happened to you, whoever did this, they're going to be held accountable. But I need you to help me understand what we're dealing with. She nodded slowly. My family had money, Officer Rivera. A lot of money. And I was the only thing standing between my sister and that money. They climbed the basement stairs in silence, Rivera's mind racing through possibilities. Family disputes over inheritances weren't uncommon, but keeping someone in prison for over 15 years required resources, planning, and an absolutely ruthless disregard for human life. The main floor of the abandoned warehouse was a maze of broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. But Rivera noticed something that contradicted the building's seemingly derelict state: fresh tire tracks in the dust near the loading dock. Someone had been here recently. Someone had been maintaining Celeste's prison. The anonymous tip that brought me here, Rivera said as they walked toward the exit. Do you know who might have called it in? Celeste paused near a broken window, sunlight streaming across her face for what was probably the first time in years. There was a man. Brought food, medicine, supplies. He never spoke to me directly, but I could tell. She trailed off. Tell what? I could tell he was getting tired of what he was doing. Tired of keeping someone alive who was supposed to be dead. Rivera felt his radio buzz with an incoming call. Detective Brooks, responding to his request for backup. But before he could answer, Celeste grabbed his arm with surprising strength. Officer Rivera, there's something else you need to know. Something that's going to make this much more complicated than you think. What's that? I'm not the only one. There were others at the facility. Other people whose families found it convenient for them to just disappear. The words hit Rivera like a physical blow. Not just individual imprisonment, but systematic elimination of inconvenient family members. The scope of what they might be dealing with was staggering. Detective Alana Brooks's voice came through clearly on his radio. Rivera, I'm pulling up to your location now. What exactly am I walking into? Rivera looked at Celeste, who was squinting in the afternoon sunlight like someone seeing the world for the first time. Detective, you're walking into something that's going to change how we think about family, money, and what people will do to get both. As Brooks's unmarked sedan pulled up to the warehouse, Celeste reached into her other pocket and produced something that made Rivera's blood run cold. A small, leather-bound address book. Worn and water-stained, but filled with names, addresses, and phone numbers written in multiple hands. What is that? Rivera asked. The other families, Celeste said quietly. The ones who made the same choice my sister did. The ones who decided it was easier to bury their problems than solve them. But what Detective Brooks discovered when she ran Celeste's fingerprints would reveal a truth more shocking than anyone could have imagined. What she whispered next would change everything. Subscribe so you don't miss the shocking truth. Detective Alana Brooks had seen enough crime scenes to know when something didn't add up. As she descended into the basement where Celeste Washington had been imprisoned, every detail screamed professional operation rather than random cruelty. This wasn't improvised, Brooks said to Rivera, running her flashlight along the cage's welded joints. Someone invested serious money in keeping her here. Look at this construction: reinforced steel mesh, commercial-grade locks, proper ventilation systems. Celeste sat in the back of the ambulance, wrapped in a blanket but refusing medical transport. Her sharp eyes tracked every movement of the investigating officers, as if she was cataloging their reactions for future reference. "The building owner claims he hasn't been here in 5 years, Rivera reported, consulting his notes. "Says he had no idea anyone was using the basement." Brooks examined the electrical setup powering the space heater and noticed something that made her pulse quicken. "Marcus, look at this wiring. This isn't some jury-rigged connection. Someone hired professional electricians to run power down here safely." She photographed the setup methodically, each image revealing more evidence of long-term planning. The toilet wasn't a portable camping unit, it was a proper waste management system connected to the building's main sewer line. The ventilation wasn't just a fan, it was an engineered air circulation system that would prevent carbon monoxide buildup. "Whoever did this wanted to keep her alive," Brooks muttered. "But just barely." Celeste's voice drifted in from outside. "Detective, may I speak with you?" Brooks climbed the basement stairs and approached the ambulance where Celeste sat with surprising composure. Despite her ordeal, the woman's posture remained dignified, her speech patterns educated and precise. "You said you remember everything," Brooks began gently. "Can you tell me about the last thing you recall before waking up in that cage?" Celeste closed her eyes, her face tightening with concentration. A white room. Sterile. The smell of antiseptic. She paused, fragments of memory clearly painful. There were doctors. My sister Victoria was there, crying. She kept saying she was sorry, that this was the only way. The only way for what? To protect the family. Celeste's voice carried bitter irony. "Victoria said I was getting worse, that I was becoming dangerous to myself and others. The doctors agreed that long-term care was the only option." Brooks made notes while studying Celeste's body language. No signs of the disorganization or confusion typically associated with severe mental illness. Her narrative was coherent, chronological, and disturbingly detailed. "What's the last date you remember clearly?" Brooks asked. "March 15, 2008. The day they admitted me to Riverside Psychiatric Institute." Celeste touched the faded hospital bracelet still on her wrist. "I remember because it was our mother's birthday. I thought it was cruel timing." Brooks felt pieces clicking into place with uncomfortable precision. "Celeste, what happened to your parents?" "Car accident, December 2007. Drunk driver hit them head-on coming home from their anniversary dinner." Celeste's voice remained steady, but her hands clenched. "They left everything to Victoria and me jointly. 50-50 split of about $50 million. $50 million. Brooks had worked enough financial crimes to understand that kind of money could motivate almost anything, including making inconvenient relatives disappear. "But you said Victoria was crying, that she seemed genuinely upset about your institutionalization." "Victoria always was a good actress." Celeste's smile held no warmth. "She cried at our parents' funeral too, right before she started pushing me to sign power of attorney documents." Brooks's radio crackled with an update from the crime scene team. "Detective Brooks, you need to see what we found in the building owner's office." She left Celeste with Rivera and climbed to the second floor, where the building's main office had been converted into a monitoring station. Multiple screens showed camera feeds from throughout the warehouse, but most interesting was a scheduling board with dates, times, and cryptic notations. "Feeding schedule," explained Officer Janet Chen, the crime scene photographer. "Someone's been maintaining detailed logs of when to bring food, medicine, supplies. Look at these entries." Brooks studied the board. Entries going back years, all in the same handwriting. CW, medication adjustment, reduced dosage. CW, increased caloric intake, subject losing weight. CW, visitor inquiry, maintain security protocols. Visitor inquiry? Brooks asked. Chen pointed to a more recent entry. 3 weeks ago. Someone was asking questions about the building, specifically about basement access. The notation says security protocols were maintained, whatever that means. Brooks felt her investigative instincts firing on all cylinders. Someone had been asking about Celeste recently, which might explain the anonymous tip that led to her discovery. Back in the basement, Brooks noticed something she'd missed during her initial examination. A small medical station tucked behind the water storage, syringes, medication bottles, basic monitoring equipment. Rivera, get me an evidence kit. I want samples of everything in this medical setup. The medication bottles were prescription-only psychiatric drugs, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, sedatives. All prescribed to C. Washington by Dr. Edmund Thorne at Riverside Psychiatric Institute. All dated within the past 6 months. These prescriptions are current, Brooks said, showing Rivera the labels. Someone's been keeping her medicated this entire time. Rivera examined the bottles with growing alarm. Detective, Riverside Psychiatric was shut down 8 years ago. Federal investigation found they were billing insurance for deceased patients and conducting unauthorized drug trials. Brooks felt ice form in her chest. Get me everything you can find on Dr. Edmund Thorne and Riverside Psychiatric Institute. Also run a property search on this building, I want to know who really owns it. While Rivera made the calls, Brooks returned to Celeste, who was now standing beside the ambulance, stretching muscles that had clearly been confined for too long. Celeste, I need to ask you about Dr. Edmund Thorne. The name hit Celeste like a physical blow. She grabbed the ambulance door frame for support, her face going pale. He's the one who signed my commitment papers. The one who declared me mentally incompetent. Celeste's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Victoria brought him to the house 3 times before my parents died. Said she was worried about my behavior after their accident. What kind of behavior? I was asking questions about the accident. About the insurance investigation. About why the other driver's blood alcohol tests kept getting delayed. Celeste met Brooks's eyes directly. I was starting to think my parents' death wasn't as accidental as everyone claimed. Brooks felt the ground shift beneath her understanding. Not just inheritance fraud, but potentially murder disguised as accident, covered up by false psychiatric commitment. Her phone buzzed with results from Rivera's searches. Dr. Edmund Thorne had lost his medical license in 2016 for falsifying patient records and participating in insurance fraud. But according to state licensing boards, he was still practicing under a different name in Nevada. Still writing prescriptions for patients who were supposed to be dead. Celeste, Brooks said carefully, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer. What is it? Are you absolutely certain about the date you were committed to Riverside? March 15, 2008. I'm certain. Brooks showed Celeste her phone screen, displaying the search results Rivera had sent. According to state records, Celeste M. Washington was declared deceased on March 18, 2008. Cause of death listed as complications from psychiatric treatment. Celeste stared at the screen in silence, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. They killed me, she said quietly. Legally, officially, they killed me 3 days after they locked me away. The records showed something impossible, but Brooks was holding the evidence that made it terrifyingly real. The records showed something impossible. Subscribe before you're left behind. The silence in the police station records room was deafening as Detective Brooks stared at the impossible documents spread across her desk. In one folder, Celeste Washington's death certificate, signed by Dr. Edmund Thorne, dated March 18, 2008. In another, fingerprint results confirming that the woman they'd rescued from the basement cage was absolutely, undeniably, the same Celeste Washington who was supposed to be dead. 15 years, Brooks muttered to herself. Someone has been collecting inheritance money on a dead woman who's been alive the entire time. Rivera approached with a steaming cup of coffee and a grim expression. It gets worse, Detective. I ran financials on the Washington estate. Victoria Washington Sterling has been receiving monthly distributions as the sole surviving heir since 2008. We're talking about nearly $40 million over 15 years. Brooks felt her jaw clench. Washington Sterling? She married Richard Sterling, estate attorney who handled the Washington parents' will and Celeste's commitment proceedings. Rivera set down a thick file. They had a very convenient wedding 6 months after Celeste was declared dead. The pieces of an elaborate conspiracy were falling into place with sickening precision. Brooks opened the Sterling file and immediately understood why this case was about to become much more complicated. Richard Sterling isn't just any attorney, she realized aloud. He's connected to half the political establishment in this city. Serves on hospital boards, charity foundations, judicial selection committees. Before Rivera could respond, the station's front desk sergeant appeared in the doorway. Detective Brooks, you've got visitors. Says it's urgent regarding the Washington case. Brooks and Rivera exchanged glances. Word traveled fast in legal circles, especially when it involved prominent attorneys and supposedly dead heiresses. The man waiting in interview room 2 was exactly what Brooks expected from a high-powered estate attorney. Richard Sterling wore a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. His silver hair was immaculately styled, his manner confident and commanding. But his eyes carried something that looked suspiciously like panic barely held in check. Detective Brooks, Sterling began before she could even sit down, I understand there's been some confusion regarding a woman found in an abandoned building. I'm here to clarify a very delicate medical situation. What kind of medical situation? Brooks asked, activating her recording equipment. My sister-in-law, Celeste Washington, suffered from severe psychiatric disorders following our parents' tragic death in 2007. Her condition deteriorated rapidly, and she became a danger to herself and others. Brooks studied Sterling's body language. His words were rehearsed, but his hands were shaking almost imperceptibly. Mr. Sterling, are you aware that Celeste Washington was declared dead in 2008? A terrible administrative error, Sterling replied quickly. Due to complications during her psychiatric treatment. We've been working with state agencies for years to correct the paperwork, but bureaucratic processes move slowly. The lies were smooth, practiced, but Brooks had spent enough years interviewing guilty parties to recognize coached responses. Mr. Sterling, where exactly has Celeste been receiving treatment for the past 15 years? Sterling's pause was just a fraction too long. A private facility. Very discreet, very specialized. Her condition required unique accommodations. What facility? I'm afraid I can't disclose that information without proper legal authorization. Patient confidentiality laws are quite strict regarding psychiatric treatment. Brooks leaned forward, her voice taking on an edge. Mr. Sterling, we found Celeste Washington locked in a cage in a basement. She's been imprisoned for over 15 years. Are you telling me that constitutes psychiatric treatment? Sterling's composure cracked visibly. Detective, you don't understand the complexities of this situation. Celeste's mental state is extremely fragile. Her perception of reality can be unreliable. Her perception seems pretty clear to me. She remembers you, her sister Victoria, Dr. Thorne, and the circumstances of her commitment with remarkable accuracy. Paranoid delusions often contain elements of truth mixed with fantasy. It's what makes them so convincing. Sterling was recovering his lawyer's instincts, but sweat was visible on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Brooks opened the file folder and placed Celeste's fingerprint results on the table. "These are definitive, Mr. Sterling. The woman we found is absolutely Celeste Washington. The same woman who was declared dead and whose estate you and your wife have been managing for 15 years. Sterling stared at the fingerprint report, his face going pale. "Detective, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding is thinking you could keep someone imprisoned indefinitely while stealing their inheritance." Brooks's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Where is Victoria, Mr. Sterling?" "My wife she's been traveling. European art markets. She's quite the collector." Sterling's answers were becoming increasingly desperate. "But I can arrange for her to return immediately to help clarify this situation." Rivera entered the interview room with an urgent expression and a handful of documents. "Detective, we need to speak. Now." Brooks stepped outside with Rivera, leaving Sterling alone to contemplate his increasingly precarious legal position. "What is it?" Brooks asked. "Property records came back. The warehouse where we found Celeste. It's owned by a shell company called Sterling Holdings, LLC. Registered in Delaware, but the actual ownership traces back to Richard and Victoria Sterling." Brooks felt pieces of the conspiracy crystallizing into concrete criminal charges. "They own the building where they imprisoned her. It gets better. I found medical supply invoices going back 12 years. Regular orders for psychiatric medications, medical monitoring equipment, and institutional food supplies. All purchased by Sterling Holdings and delivered to that warehouse." The scope of the premeditated crime was staggering. This wasn't impulsive greed, it was systematic, methodical elimination of an inconvenient family member. "There's more," Rivera continued. "Victoria Sterling boarded a private flight to Switzerland 3 hours ago. According to flight records, she took multiple suitcases and what appeared to be artwork or valuables." Brooks felt her pulse spike. "She's running. She knows we found Celeste. How could she know? We haven't released any information to the media." Brooks looked back at the interview room where Sterling was sitting rigid with tension. "Because her husband called her the moment we brought him in for questioning." They returned to find Sterling standing by the window, his confident demeanor completely shattered. He turned as they entered, and Brooks could see defeat written across his features. "Mr. Sterling, we know you own the building where Celeste was imprisoned. We have records of medical supplies you purchased to keep her sedated and confined. And we know your wife just fled the country." Sterling collapsed into his chair, his head in his hands. "You don't understand the pressure we were under. The debts, the commitments we'd made based on the inheritance. So you decided to murder her. We never intended to hurt her. The plan was just to keep her in treatment until we could stabilize our finances. Just a few years until the estate was properly managed." Brooks stared at him in disbelief. "A few years became 15 years, Mr. Sterling. You kept an innocent woman locked in a cage for 15 years while you spent her inheritance." Sterling looked up with desperate eyes. "She was never supposed to recover. Dr. Thorne assured us that her condition was permanent, that she would never be competent to manage the estate. But she did recover, didn't she? And that's when you had to keep her imprisoned to maintain your fraud." Sterling's silence was confession enough. Brooks's phone buzzed with a text message from the station, Celeste asking to speak with Detective Brooks urgently. Says she remembers something about her sister's plans. As Brooks prepared to leave Sterling for booking processing, he grabbed her arm desperately. "Detective, you have to understand," Victoria was terrified. "She kept saying Celeste would destroy our family if she ever got free." Brooks pulled her arm away. Your family destroyed itself, Mr. Sterling. Celeste was just the victim. But what Celeste remembered about her sister's plans would reveal that Victoria's desperation ran even deeper than anyone suspected. Her sister's promise hid a deadly secret. Subscribe to uncover the betrayal. Detective Brooks found Celeste in the station's victim services room, sitting upright in a chair that dwarfed her slight frame. Despite 15 years of imprisonment, she maintained an almost regal bearing. Her eyes, sharp and focused, tracked Brooks's movement as she entered. You said you remembered something about Victoria's plans, Brooks began, settling into the chair across from Celeste. Not her plans, Celeste corrected, her voice carrying a weight that made Brooks lean forward. Her fears. Victoria wasn't just greedy, detective. She was terrified of what I knew about our parents' death. Brooks activated her recording device, sensing this conversation would be crucial. What did you know? Celeste closed her eyes, accessing memories that had clearly been buried under years of forced medication. December 20th, 2007. 3 days before my parents died. Victoria came to my apartment in a panic. She paused, organizing thoughts that had been chemically suppressed for over a decade. Victoria had gambling debts. Serious ones. The kind that get people hurt if they're not paid quickly. Celeste's voice remained steady, but her hands clenched. She'd been borrowing against the family business, forging Dad's signature on loan documents. Brooks made notes while studying Celeste's demeanor. No signs of confusion or false memory syndrome. Her recollections were specific, chronological, and devastatingly detailed. How much money are we talking about? $8 million. Victoria had been systematically looting the business accounts for 2 years, covering it up with increasingly elaborate financial manipulations. Celeste met Brooks's gaze directly. She begged me not to tell our parents. Said she just needed time to fix everything. The pieces were forming a picture that made Brooks's blood run cold. But you were going to tell them. I had an appointment with Dad for December 23rd. I was going to show him the documents Victoria had stupidly left in my apartment, bank statements, forged signatures, loan applications. Celeste's voice carried bitter irony. I never made that appointment. Brooks felt the timeline clicking into place with horrible precision. Because your parents died in a car accident on December 23rd. The same day I was supposed to expose Victoria's theft. Celeste leaned forward, her intelligence blazing despite years of chemical suppression. Detective, I spent 15 years in that cage thinking about that timing. 15 years to remember every detail of that accident. Brooks's pulse quickened. What details? The other driver, supposedly drunk, had no prior history of alcohol abuse. He was actually in AA, had been sober for 3 years. Celeste's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. His blood alcohol tests were delayed for 6 hours after the accident. Plenty of time for someone to tamper with samples. You think Victoria arranged your parents' murder? I think Victoria paid someone to make sure I never had that conversation with Dad. Celeste's composure cracked slightly. And when I started investigating the accident, asking questions, demanding answers, she realized I was still a threat. Brooks's phone buzzed with an urgent message from Rivera, Sterling talking. Says Victoria made calls to family friends in Nevada right after parents' funeral. Dr. Thorne was one of them. The conspiracy was revealing layers of premeditation that made Brooks's head spin. Celeste, did Victoria know Dr. Thorne before your parents died? Victoria introduced him as a family friend who specialized in grief counseling. Celeste's laugh held no humor. She arranged for him to come to the house, said she was worried about my emotional instability after the accident. But you weren't emotionally unstable. I was asking the right questions. That's what made me dangerous. Celeste stood and moved to the window, looking out at the city she hadn't seen in 15 years. Victoria needed me declared incompetent before I could access the evidence I'd been gathering. Brooks felt the full scope of Victoria's planning crystallizing. Murder the parents to stop the theft from being exposed, then eliminate the only witness by having her declared mentally incompetent and eventually dead. The commitment proceedings were rushed, Celeste continued. Dr. Thorne provided psychiatric evaluation based on 3 brief meetings where I was clearly grieving my parents. Richard Sterling expedited the legal paperwork. Everyone agreed I was too unstable to make rational decisions. And once you were committed, you couldn't contest their management of the estate. Worse than that. Once I was declared dead, I legally ceased to exist. No rights, no legal standing, no way to challenge anything they did. Celeste turned back to Brooks. It was the perfect crime, detective. Murder, theft, and imprisonment disguised as family concern for a mentally ill relative. Brooks's radio crackled with Rivera's voice. Detective, we've got a problem. Victoria Sterling just landed in Geneva and she's requesting political asylum. Claims she's being persecuted for trying to protect her mentally ill sister. Brooks felt her jaw tighten. Even in flight, Victoria was still manipulating the narrative, still portraying herself as the victim. There's something else, Celeste said, apparently having heard the radio transmission. Victoria didn't just steal the inheritance money. She's been selling off pieces of our parents' art collection for years. Pieces that were supposed to go to specific museums and charities according to Dad's will. How do you know that? The man who brought me food and supplies, he wasn't just a caretaker. He was an art dealer. I recognized some of the pieces he described selling. Celeste's voice carried grim satisfaction. Victoria's been liquidating assets internationally, probably preparing for exactly this scenario. Brooks's phone rang. The caller ID showed an international number. Detective Brooks. This is Agent Sarah Chen with Interpol's Financial Crimes Division. We understand you're investigating Victoria Washington Sterling. Brooks put the call on speaker with Celeste's permission. Yes, she just fled to Switzerland. We've been tracking Ms. Sterling for 18 months as part of a broader investigation into international art theft and money laundering. Her asylum request has been flagged because we have evidence of systematic fraud spanning multiple countries. Celeste smiled for the first time since Brooks had met her. Victoria always was thorough. Too thorough. Agent Chen continued. We need the woman you rescued to provide testimony about the stolen artworks and their disposition. Her information could help us recover millions in stolen cultural artifacts. Brooks looked at Celeste, who was nodding with determination. Detective, I've been waiting 15 years to tell this story. I'm ready. But as they prepared for Celeste's formal statement, Brooks's radio erupted with urgent traffic from the station. All units, be advised, armed individuals have been seen surveilling the police station. Possible threat to the Washington investigation witnesses. Brooks felt ice form in her veins. Victoria might have fled, but clearly she'd left behind people willing to ensure Celeste never had the chance to testify. Through the victim services room window, Brooks spotted 2 black SUVs parked across the street. Vehicles that hadn't been there an hour ago. Celeste, Brooks said urgently, we need to move you to a secure location. Now. But as they headed for the door, it opened to reveal someone who made Celeste step backward in shock. A woman who looked remarkably like Victoria Sterling stood in the doorway, but this wasn't Victoria. Hello, Celeste, the woman said with cold familiarity. I'm Victoria's attorney. And I have court orders demanding your immediate release to psychiatric custody. The sister's arrival changed everything. Subscribe before the next twist catches you off guard. The woman standing in the doorway wore an expression of calculated authority that made Detective Brooks's instincts scream danger. Everything about her, from the perfectly tailored black suit to the leather briefcase clutched in manicured hands, projected legal power and financial resources. "I'm attorney Helena Morrison," she announced, producing documents with theatrical precision. "I represent the Sterling family's interests, and I have court orders requiring the immediate psychiatric evaluation and protective custody of Ms. Washington." Celeste backed against the window, her face pale but her voice steady. "Detective Brooks, this woman has never been my attorney. I've never seen her before in my life." Brooks examined the court documents, her trained eye immediately spotting irregularities. "Ms. Morrison, these orders are dated today, issued by Judge Hamilton Carter. How did you obtain emergency psychiatric commitments in less than 6 hours?" Morrison's smile was razor-sharp. "Judge Carter is a family friend who understands the delicate nature of Ms. Washington's condition. Her recent episode clearly demonstrates she remains a danger to herself and others." "What episode?" Brooks demanded. "Breaking into private property, destroying security systems, creating elaborate fantasies about imprisonment and conspiracy." Morrison's voice carried practiced condescension. "Classic symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia with violent tendencies." Celeste stepped forward, her dignity intact despite 15 years of abuse. "Detective, she's rewriting history in real time. Everything I've told you can be verified through physical evidence, financial records, witness testimony." Morrison opened her briefcase and produced a thick medical file. Ms. Washington's psychiatric history speaks for itself. Multiple hospitalizations, treatment-resistant delusions, previous episodes of breaking and entering when off her medication. Brooks felt the legal trap closing around them with professional precision. Morrison wasn't just some hired attorney, this was a systematic operation designed to discredit Celeste's testimony and restore the Sterling family's control. "I'll need to verify these court orders with Judge Carter's office," Brooks said. "Of course. But in the meantime, patient safety protocols require that Ms. Washington be placed in secure psychiatric hold pending full evaluation." Morrison gestured toward the hallway where 2 men in white medical uniforms waited with a wheelchair and restraints. Celeste's composure finally cracked. "They're going to disappear me again. 15 years wasn't enough, they need to finish what they started." Brooks positioned herself between Celeste and the door, her hand moving instinctively toward her service weapon. "Nobody's taking anyone anywhere until I verify the legitimacy of these proceedings." Her radio crackled with Rivera's urgent voice, "Detective, Judge Carter's office has no record of emergency psychiatric orders issued today. They say the judge is on vacation in Florida and hasn't signed any documents this week." Morrison's confident expression flickered momentarily. "There must be some administrative delay. Emergency mental health proceedings often take time to appear in the system." "Cut the bullshit," Brooks snapped. "These are forged documents, and you're not taking Celeste anywhere." The 2 men in medical uniforms stepped into the room, their movements coordinated and aggressive. "Ma'am, we have legal authority to transport this patient for her own safety." Brooks drew her weapon, her voice carrying absolute authority. "Back away from her. Now." The standoff lasted only seconds before Rivera burst through the door with backup officers, their weapons drawn and trained on Morrison's fake medical team. "Helena Morrison," Rivera announced, "you're under arrest for falsifying court documents, attempted kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Morrison's professional facade crumbled completely. "You don't understand what you're interfering with. This woman is dangerous. The Sterling family has been protecting the community from her for years. By keeping her locked in a basement cage." Brooks's voice carried deadly calm. "That's an interesting definition of community protection." As Rivera cuffed Morrison, she made one final desperate play. MS. Washington has been receiving continuous psychiatric care in a private facility. Her family has spent millions ensuring she receives the best treatment available. Celeste laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Treatment? You call forced medication, isolation, and psychological torture treatment? Brooks's phone buzzed with an urgent message from the FBI Financial Crimes Unit, Sterling Holdings linked to network of fraudulent psychiatric facilities across 6 states. Pattern suggests systematic elimination of inconvenient family members. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Not just Celeste's imprisonment, but potentially dozens of other victims trapped in similar situations across the country. Rivera, Brooks said, contact FBI agent Martinez immediately. This case just became a federal investigation into organized crime. Morrison was dragged away still protesting her legal authority, but her fake medical team proved more troubling. Under interrogation, they revealed they weren't medical professionals at all, they were private security contractors hired to transport difficult psychiatric patients, with no questions asked. How many people have you transported? Brooks demanded. The lead contractor, a man whose military bearing suggested professional training, looked genuinely shaken by the day's revelations. Dozens over the past 5 years. Always the same routine: court orders, psychiatric holds, transport to private facilities. What facilities? All over the country. Nevada, Wyoming, Montana. Remote locations, high security, no visitors allowed. He paused, comprehension dawning. Jesus Christ, we weren't transporting psychiatric patients. We were disappearing people. Brooks felt sick. The Sterling operation wasn't an isolated case, it was part of a systematic network designed to eliminate inconvenient family members while stealing their assets. Celeste had been listening to this interrogation through the one-way glass. When Brooks returned to her, the woman's face showed a mixture of vindication and horror. Detective, Victoria didn't create this system. She found it and used it. Celeste's voice carried grim certainty. There are others like me, trapped in cages and cells across the country, while their families spend their inheritance. Brooks's radio erupted with news that made everyone in the room stop cold. Detective Brooks, we've got developments on the Sterling case. Victoria Sterling's private flight from Geneva was forced to make an emergency landing in London. British authorities are holding her on an Interpol warrant. But the most shocking news came next: she wasn't traveling alone. British customs found 2 other women on the aircraft, both heavily sedated, both carrying forged identification documents. They appeared to be additional victims of the Sterling network. Celeste closed her eyes, pain and relief warring across her features. Victoria was running, but she couldn't leave witnesses behind. She was taking them with her to ensure their silence. Brooks felt pieces of the conspiracy crystallizing into federal charges that would span multiple jurisdictions and potentially dozens of victims. Celeste, I need you to look at some photographs. Brooks produced images from the British authorities. Do you recognize either of these women? Celeste studied the photos, her face growing pale. The younger woman, I think I saw her at Riverside Psychiatric Institute before it was shut down. She was in the bed next to mine during one of my medication adjustments. What was her name? Miranda. Miranda Chen. She kept talking about her brother trying to steal her restaurant business. Celeste looked up at Brooks. Detective, if Victoria was transporting victims internationally, this conspiracy is much bigger than just stealing inheritance money. Brooks's phone rang with a call that would change everything about their understanding of the case. Detective Brooks. This is Dr. Sarah Williams from the Centers for Disease Control. We need to discuss the medications found at your warehouse crime scene. We believe they're connected to illegal human experimentation. The pharmaceutical angle added a dimension of horror that made even seasoned investigators feel sick. Not just imprisonment and theft, but medical experimentation on helpless victims. As Brooks prepared to coordinate with federal agencies across 3 continents, she looked at Celeste, the woman whose courage to survive 15 years of hell was about to expose an international network of organized crime. But what the CDC doctor revealed about the medications would show that some betrayals run deeper than anyone could imagine. The caretaker's arrival revealed the full horror. Subscribe for the shocking truth. The CDC conference call filled the police station's main briefing room with voices from Washington, London, and Geneva as Dr. Sarah Williams delivered information that made everyone present question how deep this conspiracy actually went. The medications found at your warehouse weren't just psychiatric drugs, Dr. Williams explained through the speaker. They included experimental compounds that have never been approved for human use. Compounds designed to induce memory loss, compliance, and long-term cognitive impairment. Detective Brooks felt her blood turn to ice. You're saying they were using human subjects for illegal drug testing? We're saying the Sterling Network appears to have been running sophisticated medical experiments on imprisoned individuals for over a decade. Dr. Williams's voice carried the weight of horrific discovery. The pharmaceutical compounds found at your scene match samples we've been tracking through black market medical supply chains across 6 countries. Celeste sat in the corner of the briefing room, her face pale but her voice steady when she spoke. That explains why they kept adjusting my medications. Why some days I could think clearly and other days I couldn't remember my own name. Brooks looked at the evidence files spread across the table, medication logs, dosage charts, behavioral observations. What she'd initially interpreted as crude imprisonment was actually detailed medical documentation of human experimentation. Rivera entered with updates from British authorities that made the international scope even clearer. Victoria Sterling is talking. She's trying to negotiate immunity by providing information about the network's leadership. What's she saying? That she wasn't running the operation. She was just a regional affiliate, managing assets in the northeastern United States. Rivera consulted his notes. According to her statement, the network is called Family Solutions International. They specialize in making problematic family members disappear while providing legal cover for asset seizure. Agent Martinez's voice crackled through the secure phone line from FBI headquarters. We've been tracking Family Solutions for 3 years. They operate like a franchise. Local attorneys and medical professionals provide services to wealthy families who need to eliminate inheritance obstacles. Celeste leaned forward, her intelligence blazing despite years of chemical suppression. Detective, this explains why Dr. Thorne was so confident about my prognosis. He wasn't treating mental illness, he was conducting experiments to see how effectively they could erase someone's identity and legal competency. Brooks felt pieces of the conspiracy clicking into place with sickening precision. The perfect victims. People who've been legally declared dead or incompetent have no rights, no legal standing, no way to report abuse. Dr. Williams continued her briefing with details that made seasoned law enforcement officers visibly uncomfortable. We've identified compounds designed to induce specific types of memory loss, targeting recent memories while leaving older ones intact. The goal appears to be creating subjects who remember their past but can't form new memories or challenge their current circumstances. Like chemical lobotomies, Rivera muttered. Exactly like that. But reversible, controllable, and leaving no permanent physical evidence. Dr. Williams paused. Ms. Washington, the fact that you retained as much cognitive function as you have suggests either genetic resistance to these compounds or deliberate underdosing. Celeste's voice carried bitter understanding. They needed me functional enough to sign documents when necessary. Completely destroying my mind would have made me useless for their legal manipulations. Brooks's phone buzzed with an urgent message from Interpol. Sterling network raids conducted simultaneously across 12 facilities in 8 countries. Estimated 200+ victims recovered. Request immediate witness testimony. The scope was staggering. Hundreds of people, imprisoned and experimented on while their families lived off stolen inheritances. Celeste, Brooks said gently, "We're going to need your testimony to build cases against everyone involved in this network. Are you prepared for that?" "Detective, I've been preparing for 15 years. Celeste stood, her posture carrying the dignity of someone who'd survived the unthinkable. "But I want more than just testimony. I want to help rescue the others." Agent Martinez's voice carried excitement through the secure line. "MS. Washington, your knowledge of the medication protocols, the psychological manipulation techniques, the physical layouts of the facilities, that information could be crucial for helping other victims recover." Brooks watched Celeste process this request. After 15 years of imprisonment and abuse, she was being asked to relive her trauma to help save others. The courage required was enormous. "What about Victoria and Richard?" Celeste asked. "What happens to them?" Rivera consulted the latest updates from federal prosecutors. Richard Sterling is facing federal charges for conspiracy, fraud, kidnapping, and human trafficking. He's looking at life without parole. And Victoria? Victoria's cooperation with international authorities might reduce her sentence, but she's still facing decades in prison across multiple jurisdictions. Rivera's voice carried grim satisfaction. Her testimony is helping authorities dismantle the entire network. Brooks studied Celeste's expression, searching for signs of revenge or bitterness. Instead, she found something that looked like sadness mixed with determination. "Detective, I want to see Victoria before she's extradited." "Why?" "Because I need to understand how someone becomes capable of doing this to their own family. Not for forgiveness, for comprehension." The request was unusual, but Brooks understood the psychological need for closure. "I'll arrange it through the British authorities." Agent Martinez's voice interrupted their conversation with news that would change everything about how they understood Victoria's motivations. "Detective Brooks, we've uncovered financial records that shed new light on Victoria Sterling's involvement." "What kind of records?" Victoria wasn't just stealing Celeste's inheritance. She was in debt to the Family Solutions Network for over $2 million before her parents died. The imprisonment scheme wasn't just about greed. It was about survival. Brooks felt the last pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Victoria was already trapped in the network before she imprisoned Celeste. Exactly. She'd borrowed money from Family Solutions to cover gambling debts, then couldn't repay them. They offered her a solution: eliminate her inheritance obstacle and split the proceeds with the network. Celeste closed her eyes, processing this information. So Victoria didn't create this nightmare. She was already caught in it when she decided to drag me down with her. "That doesn't excuse what she did to you," Brooks said firmly. "No, it doesn't. But it explains how someone I grew up with, someone I loved, could transform into someone capable of such cruelty." Celeste's voice carried the weight of understanding rather than forgiveness. The conference call continued with coordination details for international prosecutions, victim rehabilitation programs, and asset recovery operations. But Brooks found herself focusing on Celeste, this remarkable woman who'd survived 15 years of hell and was now choosing to help rather than seek revenge. Rivera approached with one final update that would test everyone's faith in justice. "Detective, we've got a problem. 3 more attorneys claiming to represent various Sterling interests have filed motions to have Celeste's testimony declared inadmissible due to her history of psychiatric treatment." Brooks felt her jaw tighten. Even with Victoria in custody and the network exposed, there were still lawyers trying to silence the victims. "What's their argument?" That prolonged psychiatric medication makes her testimony unreliable. They're claiming she can't distinguish between reality and delusion. Celeste laughed, a sound that carried strength rather than bitterness. Let them try. I've got 15 years of evidence, international witness testimony, and medical records that prove exactly how reliable my memory really is. But her next words would surprise everyone in the room and define how justice would ultimately be served. Her decision would surprise everyone. Subscribe for the powerful conclusion. Detective Brooks waited in the police station's main conference room as Celeste stared out the window at the city she hadn't seen freely in 15 years. The morning sun illuminated her face, highlighting both the scars of her ordeal and the strength that had carried her through it. I've made my decision about how I want justice to be served, Celeste said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd survived the unthinkable. But it's not what anyone expects. Brooks had seen enough victims over the years to recognize that moment when someone chooses their path forward. With Celeste, she sensed something profound was about to emerge. What do you want, Celeste? I want to transform that warehouse basement into something meaningful. A memorial for the victims who didn't survive, and a training center for law enforcement to recognize signs of systematic family abuse. Celeste turned from the window, her eyes blazing with purpose. I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else. The decision surprised Brooks completely. After 15 years of imprisonment, torture, and experimentation, Celeste was choosing rehabilitation over retribution. Rivera entered with updates from the international prosecutions. The Sterling Network trials are proceeding across multiple jurisdictions. Richard Sterling pled guilty to all charges, he's looking at life without parole. Victoria's cooperation has helped authorities identify over 300 victims across 12 countries. 300, Celeste repeated quietly. 300 families willing to destroy their own relatives for money. Agent Martinez joined the briefing via secure video link from FBI headquarters. MS. Washington, your testimony has been crucial in building these cases. But more importantly, your insights into the psychological manipulation techniques are helping other victims recover their identities and legal standing. Brooks watched Celeste process this information with characteristic grace. Despite everything she'd endured, her primary concern remained helping others rather than celebrating her tormentor's downfall. What about the pharmaceutical companies that provided the experimental drugs? Celeste asked. 3 major corporations are facing federal charges for conducting illegal human experiments. The FDA has launched a comprehensive investigation into black market medical supply chains. Agent Martinez's voice carried grim satisfaction. Your medical records provided crucial evidence of systematic human rights violations. The conference call continued with details about victim rehabilitation programs, asset recovery operations, and international cooperation agreements. But Brooks found herself focusing on Celeste's extraordinary resilience and capacity for transformation. 6 months later, Brooks stood in the basement that had once been Celeste's prison. The concrete space had been transformed into something beautiful and meaningful, a memorial wall displaying photographs and names of victims, surrounded by educational displays about financial abuse and systematic family exploitation. The Celeste Washington Center for Family Justice Protection, she read from the dedication plaque. Established to ensure that vulnerable family members are protected from systematic abuse and exploitation. Celeste approached, wearing professional clothing that reflected her restored status and dignity. Her hair was styled, her bearing confident, her voice strong. Detective, I wanted to thank you personally for seeing past the surface on that first day. For recognizing that I was a victim rather than a mentally ill vagrant. Brooks felt emotion tighten her throat. Celeste, what you've accomplished, transforming your trauma into something that protects others, it's extraordinary. I had help. And I had 15 years to think about what justice really means. Celeste gestured toward the memorial wall. Revenge would have felt good for maybe a day. But prevention, protection, education, that creates lasting change. The center had already trained over 200 law enforcement officers, social workers, and legal professionals to recognize signs of systematic family abuse. Celeste's story had become a case study in how financial incentives could motivate the most horrific betrayals. "How are the other victims doing?" Brooks asked. "Recovery is complicated. Some of the people rescued from Family Solutions facilities have been imprisoned for decades. Their families had them declared dead, stole their identities, erased their entire existence." Celeste's voice carried pain for others suffering. "But we're rebuilding lives, one person at a time." Brooks toured the center's facilities, support groups for recovered victims, legal aid clinics for inheritance disputes, counseling services for families dealing with financial abuse. What impressed her most was how Celeste had transformed personal trauma into systemic change. "Detective, I want to show you something." Celeste led her to a quiet office where she pulled out a thick folder. "Letters from families who've used our early intervention services to prevent systematic abuse before it escalates." Brooks read testimonials from adult children who'd recognized warning signs in their parents' financial relationships, from elderly individuals who'd sought help when family members began pressuring them to sign legal documents, from attorneys who'd learned to identify potentially fraudulent guardianship proceedings. 47 families, Celeste said with quiet pride. 47 situations where we intervened before someone ended up in a basement cage. The impact was staggering. Celeste's decision to focus on prevention rather than punishment had created a ripple effect that protected vulnerable people across multiple states. Brooks's phone buzzed with a message that brought news from the final chapter of the Sterling prosecutions. Victoria Sterling died in prison last night. Apparent suicide. Celeste closed her eyes, processing this information with complex emotions. "I never got to have that conversation with her. Never got to understand how she became someone capable of such cruelty. Are you sorry she's gone?" "I'm sorry for the woman she could have been. The sister I remember from childhood, before greed and desperation transformed her into something monstrous." Celeste's voice carried sadness rather than anger. "But I'm not sorry that her victims won't have to face her testimony, won't have to relive their trauma in courtrooms." As they walked through the center's main exhibition, Brooks realized that Celeste had achieved something remarkable. She transformed the worst experience imaginable into a force for protecting others. The basement that had been her prison had become a beacon of hope for vulnerable people everywhere. "Detective, there's one more thing I want to tell you." Celeste stopped beside a display showing the international scope of the Family Solutions Network. "The inheritance money that Victoria stole, we've recovered most of it through asset forfeiture proceedings. What will you do with it? Expand the center. Open satellite locations in other states. Create a national database of suspicious family financial transactions." Celeste smiled with genuine warmth. "Transform stolen money into protection for future victims." Brooks felt profound admiration for this woman who turned ultimate victimization into ultimate service to others. Celeste had proven that justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about preventing future harm and healing systemic damage. As Brooks prepared to leave, she noticed a small plaque near the center's entrance that captured the essence of Celeste's transformation. "From the depths of human cruelty can emerge the heights of human compassion. We remember the victims. We protect the vulnerable. We ensure this never happens again." 2 years later, the Celeste Washington Center had helped identify and prevent over 200 cases of systematic family abuse. Celeste herself had testified before Congress about the need for stronger protections for vulnerable adults and more oversight of private psychiatric facilities. But perhaps most importantly, she'd shown that survival wasn't just about enduring trauma, it was about transforming that trauma into something that made the world safer for others. In the basement where she'd once cried alone in a cage, visitors now learned how to recognize and prevent the systematic destruction of human dignity. From the darkness of ultimate betrayal had emerged the light of ultimate redemption. If this story opened your eyes, subscribe, because these injustices are real.